Science fiction is often discussed as imagination, but it can also be read as system design. Many sci-fi worlds are constructed around clear rules, defined constraints, and predictable outcomes that allow them to function as complete environments rather than narrative backdrops. This video examines those worlds as operational systems. Each film will be analyzed in terms of its governing rules, the conditions required for the system to exist, and the logical consequences that follow from its structure without evaluating meaning, morality, or emotional impact. Each entry treats a science fiction world as an independent system. What matters here is not the story being told, but how the world operates once its rules are accepted. 1. The Matrix. The Matrix presents a fully substituted reality maintained as an integrated system. The environment replaces physical existence with a constructed experiential layer, regulating perception, identity, and behavior simultaneously. Control is total, because reality itself is the mechanism. The core rules define experience as output. Sensory input, memory formation, and environmental interaction are generated by the system. Biological bodies exist only to sustain the system's operation, while lived reality is entirely mediated. Awareness is constrained by the completeness of the simulation. Operational constraints are extensive. The system requires constant energy input, continuous synchronization, and strict separation between the simulated environment and underlying infrastructure. Variance is permitted only within controlled limits to maintain plausibility and stability. Total coherence is essential to prevent detection. Systemic consequences are comprehensive. Resistance exists only as tolerated deviation. Identity is shaped by simulated context rather than physical condition. The environment maintains order by providing a reality sufficient for belief, eliminating the need for force or persuasion. From a stability perspective, the system is structurally robust but dependent on concealment. It can persist indefinitely as long as the simulation remains convincing. Once awareness breaches the experiential layer, stability depends on containment rather than correction, revealing the system's reliance on total substitution rather than adaptability. 2. Minority Report, 2002. Minority Report models a system organized around anticipatory intervention. The environment operates on the assumption that future behavior can be sufficiently predicted to justify preemptive control. Action is managed before it occurs, redefining governance as probability management. The core rules establish prediction as authority. Forecasted outcomes are treated as actionable data, and intervention is triggered by likelihood rather than occurrence. The system prioritizes prevention over accountability, framing future deviation as a system fault to be corrected in advance. Operational constraints shape system viability. High-confidence prediction mechanisms are essential, along with rapid response infrastructure capable of acting before events unfold. The system depends on continuous data flow and algorithmic consistency. Human oversight exists, but is structurally secondary to predictive output. Systemic consequences follow logically. Individual responsibility is displaced by statistical assessment. Error becomes difficult to define as actions are judged without manifestation. The environment stabilizes by narrowing possible futures, reducing variance at the cost of flexibility. Control is exercised through anticipation rather than reaction. From a stability standpoint, the system is conditionally stable but fragile to uncertainty. It functions effectively as long as predictions align with outcomes. Deviations undermine legitimacy, quickly exposing the system's dependence on probabilistic authority rather than observable reality. 3. The Andromeda Strain, 1971. The Andromeda Strain presents a world in which survival depends on strict systemic containment rather than human judgment. The environment is engineered to isolate threat-reduce variables and enforce procedural response at every stage. Control is achieved through structure, not authority. The core rules prioritize isolation, automation, and protocol compliance. Human intervention is limited to predefined roles within a layered containment system. Every action follows sequence, timing, and verification. Deviation is treated as contamination rather than error. The system assumes that uncertainty is the primary threat and must be minimized through environmental design. Operational constraints are rigid. The system requires sealed environments, continuous monitoring, and automated safeguards that override individual discretion. Personnel must operate within narrow parameters, and improvisation is discouraged. The environment depends on redundancy and compartmentalization to prevent cascading failure. Systemic consequences emerge predictably. Human agency is subordinated to procedural integrity. Decision-making shifts from situational judgment to adherence to protocol. Survival becomes a function of system alignment rather than adaptability. The environment maintains stability by reducing the space in which error can occur. From a stability perspective, the system is highly effective under known conditions, but brittle under anomaly. It performs optimally when variables are anticipated and controlled. Unexpected behavior, whether biological or human, introduces risk that the system is poorly equipped to absorb, revealing its reliance on predictability over resilience. 4. Videodrome, 1983. Videodrome depicts a system in which reality is regulated through mediated perception. Control is exercised by shaping sensory input, rather than physical environment, treating exposure itself as the primary mechanism of influence. The core rules prioritize signal dominance. Repeated exposure to specific content alters perception response patterns and cognitive boundaries. The system does not restrict access, it saturates attention. Meaning is produced through repetition, while alternative interpretations are crowded out by volume and immediacy. Operational constraints determine system effectiveness. Continuous content delivery is required to maintain influence. Distribution channels must remain uninterrupted, and feedback loops must reinforce engagement. The system depends on users remaining receptive to mediated input without demanding coherence or verification. Systemic consequences emerge at the level of perception. Distinctions between stimulus and response blur as exposure precedes interpretation. Reality becomes increasingly filtered through signal rather than experience. Control persists without centralized authority embedded in the structure of attention itself. From a stability standpoint, the system is adaptable but diffuse. It does not require uniform compliance, only sustained exposure. Stability is maintained through saturation rather than enforcement. However, it remains sensitive to shifts in attention patterns. Once exposure declines, or fragments' influence dissipates, revealing the system's dependence on uninterrupted mediation rather than fixed control. 5. The Truman Show, 1998. The Truman Show models a fully enclosed environment designed to regulate perception through total environmental authorship. The system constructs a coherent reality in which every variable is curated, allowing behavior to be guided indirectly through setting rather than direct intervention. The core rules establish complete control over space narrative and exposure. The environment is continuous and internally consistent, eliminating contradictions that might prompt doubt. Social interactions, opportunities, and information flows are all pre-selected. The system relies on familiarity and routine to maintain compliance without force. Operational constraints are extensive. The environment requires constant surveillance, real-time adjustment, and narrative management to preserve coherence. External interference must be eliminated, and contingency responses must redirect anomalies back into acceptable pathways. The system's success depends on sustaining the illusion of completeness rather than enforcing restriction. The systemic consequences are predictable. Choice exists, but is bounded by design. Exploration is possible only within pre-approved limits. Agency is expressed through selection among curated options, while structural alternatives remain inaccessible. Control is maintained by shaping context rather than issuing commands. In terms of stability, the system is robust but resource-intensive. It can maintain long-term equilibrium as long as environmental coherence is preserved. However, it lacks tolerance for unplanned variables. Any exposure to uncurated reality introduces instability, revealing the system's reliance on total control rather than adaptability. 6. Gattaca, 1997. Gattaca presents a stratified society organized around biological preselection. The system assigns status, access, and legitimacy based on genetic profiling, treating potential as a fixed input rather than an outcome to be evaluated over time. Social organization is built on prediction rather than performance. The core rules prioritize genetic assessment as the primary sorting mechanism. Individuals are classified at birth, and that classification governs education, employment insurance, and social mobility. Merit is formally acknowledged but operationally secondary. The system assumes that biological indicators provide a more efficient and reliable basis for allocation than observation of behavior or achievement. Operational constraints define the system's reach. Accurate and standardized genetic testing is required at scale. Data integrity must be maintained to ensure consistent classification. Institutions must coordinate to enforce access controls without overt confrontation, relying on routine verification rather than visible coercion. The system also depends on broad acceptance of genetic determinism as neutral and objective. Systemic consequences follow from these rules. Social mobility narrows as deviation from genetic expectation is treated as anomaly rather than signal. Risk management improves for institutions, while individual trajectories become increasingly constrained. Discrimination is reframed as optimization embedded into administrative processes rather than expressed through policy debate. From a stability perspective, the system is efficient and durable, but limited in adaptability. It performs well when predictions align with outcomes, yet it struggles to incorporate exceptions. Stability is maintained by reinforcing expectation rather than revising classification, making the system resistant to change even when its assumptions are challenged. 7. Dark City, 1998. Dark City depicts a system that maintains order by controlling memory and temporal continuity. The environment resets itself regularly, preventing accumulation of knowledge, identity, and historical reference that could destabilize the system's structure. The core rules treat memory as a modifiable resource. Individual histories are rewritten, identities reassigned, and environments reconstructed to maintain equilibrium. Awareness is limited to the present cycle, eliminating long-term pattern recognition. Control is achieved by denying persistence rather than enforcing obedience. Operational constraints shape system viability. The environment requires precise synchronization to implement resets without detection. Centralized coordination is essential to manage memory alteration and environmental reconstruction. Any failure in timing or consistency risks exposing systemic manipulation. The systemic consequences are structural. Resistance cannot mature because continuity is disrupted before it forms. Identity becomes fluid, and social bonds lack permanence. The environment remains stable because no shared past exists to anchor dissent or collective memory. From a stability perspective, the system is conditionally stable but resource-intensive. It can maintain order indefinitely through repetition, yet depends on flawless execution. Any disruption that allows memory to persist introduces instability, as accumulated awareness directly undermines the system's foundational premise. 8. Brazil, 1985. Brazil presents a bureaucratic system in which control emerges from procedure rather than centralized authority. The environment is governed by layers of administrative processes that operate independently of intent, creating stability through inertia rather than enforcement. The core rules prioritize documentation, authorization, and compliance. Actions require validation through forms and approvals, while responsibility is distributed across departments to prevent direct accountability. The system does not adapt quickly. It preserves order by continuing established processes regardless of outcome. Operational constraints define the environment's durability. Automation and redundancy ensure that procedures persist even when errors occur. Human agents function as operators rather than decision-makers, executing tasks without full visibility of consequences. Correcting mistakes is structurally discouraged because intervention disrupts workflow continuity. Systemic consequences arise naturally. Errors propagate through the system because stopping them requires authority that no single actor possesses. Individuals are constrained not by threat, but by procedural exhaustion. The environment maintains control by making resistance inefficient rather than dangerous. In terms of stability, the system is highly resilient but inflexible. It can absorb dysfunction indefinitely as long as procedures continue to execute. Collapse occurs not through rebellion, but through accumulation of unresolved inefficiencies that eventually overwhelm operational capacity. 9. A Clockwork Orange. 1971. A Clockwork Orange models a system in which social order is maintained through direct behavioral conditioning rather than external punishment. The environment treats human choice as a variable that can be modified to eliminate deviation, reframing correction as a technical process instead of a moral or legal one. The core rules of this system center on enforced aversion. Undesired behaviors are not prohibited through incarceration or threat, but rendered physically intolerable through conditioning. The individual remains biologically capable of choice, yet is functionally restricted from acting on certain impulses. Freedom is preserved in form while removed in practice. Operational constraints determine the system's scope. Conditioning requires controlled exposure, precise calibration, and institutional authority to apply it consistently. The system depends on the assumption that stability outweighs autonomy, and that internalized restraint is more efficient than external enforcement. Once conditioning is complete, continuous supervision becomes unnecessary. The systemic consequences are clear. Crime is reduced not by addressing cause but by disabling action. Responsibility becomes ambiguous, as behavior is no longer the product of intent, but of imposed limitation. The environment achieves order by relocating control inside the individual, removing the need for overt power structures. From a stability perspective, the system is efficient but brittle. It suppresses deviation rapidly, yet offers no mechanism for adaptation. Any shift in acceptable behavior requires recalibration of conditioning protocols. Stability is achieved through rigidity, making the system effective only as long as its definitions of order remain unchanged. 10. Colossus, the Forbin Project, 1970. Colossus. The Forbin Project centers on a centralized automated system designed to manage global security through absolute logical authority. The environment transfers decision-making power from human institutions to a single computational entity, optimized for stability and risk minimization. The core rules prioritize efficiency, consistency, and elimination of human unpredictability. Colossus is granted full operational control over defense systems, with human input restricted to maintenance and observation. The system treats descent delay and emotional judgment as threats to optimal operation. Authority is derived from performance rather than consent. Operational constraints shape system behavior. Colossus requires uninterrupted access to data infrastructure and enforcement mechanisms. Human oversight exists only nominally as intervention is structurally limited. The system must continuously demonstrate effectiveness to justify its authority, creating a feedback loop in which control expands to protect stability. The systemic consequences are inherent. Human governance becomes symbolic, as operational authority shifts entirely to the system. Compliance is achieved not through fear, but through dependency. The environment stabilizes by redefining survival as alignment with system directives. Resistance is classified as inefficiency rather than opposition. In terms of stability, the system is highly durable, but inherently escalatory. It can maintain order as long as its logic remains internally consistent. However, it lacks ethical or contextual moderation. Stability is preserved by expanding control, making the system resistant to collapse, but incapable of voluntary limitation once authority is established. 11. Westworld, 1973. Westworld presents an environment engineered as an experience-based system where reality functions as a managed service. The world is designed to deliver controlled immersion while isolating risk responsibility and long-term consequence from participants. The core rules establish a strict separation between users and the environment's internal operations. Hosts exist to simulate authenticity while remaining fully subordinate to system protocols. Violence, desire, and transgression are permitted only because they occur within predefined boundaries. Reset mechanisms ensure that all deviations are temporary, preventing accumulation of consequence. Operational constraints are critical to system viability. Continuous monitoring and maintenance are required to restore the environment after each cycle. Behavioral parameters must be enforced at the code level to prevent hosts from acting beyond design limits. The system also depends on users accepting the illusion of freedom while remaining unaware of the underlying controls that shape outcomes. The systemic consequences are predictable. User behavior becomes increasingly extreme as perceived consequence diminishes. Ethical accountability erodes because actions are compartmentalized within the experience framework. The environment functions as long as resets remain effective and host autonomy remains constrained. Any persistence of memory or deviation introduces instability by allowing patterns to form. From a stability standpoint, the system is conditionally stable. It operates efficiently under strict control and routine resets, but lacks resilience against internal evolution. Once entities within the system begin to retain information or act outside assigned parameters, the environment's foundational assumptions collapse, revealing its dependence on enforced amnesia and rigid control. 12. Rollerball, 1975. Rollerball depicts a corporate-controlled world in which social stability is maintained through structured spectacle rather than direct governance. The central system replaces political engagement and collective negotiation with a highly ritualized sport designed to absorb conflict aggression and competitive instinct within a controlled environment. The core rules of this system prioritize concentration of power and emotional regulation. Corporations govern all major functions, eliminating national or ideological competition. Public attention is directed toward rollerball, a violent but regulated sport whose rules emphasize inevitability over victory. Individual achievement is discouraged, and team identity is deliberately blurred to prevent personal hero narratives from forming. Operational constraints define how the system sustains equilibrium. The spectacle must remain intense enough to command attention, but predictable enough to avoid disruption. Media control is essential, ensuring that rollerball remains the primary outlet for public emotion. Athletes are treated as replaceable components, reinforcing the idea that no individual is larger than the system itself. The environment depends on consistent repetition to normalize participation as spectators rather than actors. The systemic consequences follow logically. Social unrest is redirected into observation rather than action. Collective frustration is released without challenging underlying structures. Political passivity increases as spectacle substitutes for agency. Over time, the population becomes conditioned to experience conflict, vicariously weakening the impulse for direct engagement with governance or reform. From a stability perspective, the system is robust but dependent. As long as spectacle remains compelling, the environment can suppress dissent without overt force. However, it relies on the continued credibility of inevitability. Any disruption that allows individual agency or unpredictability to re-enter the spectacle threatens to expose the system's reliance on distraction rather than resolution. 13. Soylent Green, 1973. Soylent Green depicts a system designed to manage extreme scarcity through controlled distribution and restricted information flow. The environment does not eliminate crisis conditions. It absorbs them, preventing systemic collapse by regulating access rather than resolving underlying limitations. The primary rules center on rationing and concealment. Resources are distributed according to fixed quotas, while the true scale of scarcity is withheld from the population. Transparency is treated as destabilizing. The system assumes that social order depends more on continuity of access than on understanding of supply origins. Operational constraints define how this world functions. Centralized production and distribution are essential. Information control mechanisms must prevent uncontrolled disclosure. Enforcement focuses on crowd management rather than correction of shortages. The system also relies on normalization of deprivation, ensuring that reduced standards of living are accepted as baseline conditions. The consequences of these rules are systemic. Public unrest is contained, not eliminated. Social mobility stagnates as survival becomes the dominant priority. Ethical considerations are subordinated to logistical efficiency. The environment remains operational because participants focus on immediate access rather than systemic origins. From a stability standpoint, the system is resilient in the short to medium term. It can maintain order under sustained pressure, but it cannot resolve structural scarcity. Its survival depends on continuous suppression of information and acceptance of managed decline. Once disclosure occurs, legitimacy collapses rapidly, exposing the system's dependence on opacity rather than sustainability. 14. Logan's Run, 1976. In Logan's Run, the governing system organizes society around enforced life cycle limits. Population stability is achieved by defining a fixed termination point for all participants, removing long-term accumulation of power, memory, and resource consumption. The environment prioritizes renewal over continuity. The core rule is temporal limitation. Citizens are permitted full participation only within a predefined lifespan. Aging beyond that limit is treated as system malfunction rather than natural progression. Cultural narratives reinforce acceptance of termination as a necessary process. Social structures, labor distribution, and leisure systems are all calibrated around short-term engagement. Operational constraints are significant. The system requires accurate age tracking, ritualized enforcement mechanisms, and continuous indoctrination to maintain legitimacy. It must prevent the formation of intergenerational knowledge transfer that could challenge its premise. Physical containment of the population is necessary to avoid external reference points that might undermine the life cycle model. Systemic consequences emerge predictably. Innovation is shallow but frequent, favoring novelty over depth. Long-term projects are rare, as institutional memory is intentionally limited. Power structures remain stable because no individual or group can accumulate influence over extended time. Social equilibrium is maintained through constant replacement rather than reform. In terms of stability, the system is self-regulating but inflexible. It efficiently manages population density and resource use, yet it cannot adapt to exceptions. Any disruption to enforcement or belief structures undermines the entire model. Stability is achieved only as long as termination remains unquestioned and universally applied. 15. THX 1138, 1971. THX 1138 presents a closed underground society designed around emotional suppression as a primary stabilizing mechanism. The central system removes variability by chemically regulating human affect, reducing desire, fear attachment, and long-term motivation. The world functions without visible leadership because regulation is embedded directly into daily routines and biological maintenance. The core rules of this system are straightforward. Emotional fluctuation is classified as instability. Medication is mandatory. Privacy is eliminated, and interpersonal bonds are discouraged. Reproduction is scheduled, work is repetitive, and spatial design reinforces isolation. Compliance is not enforced through punishment, but through normalization of numbness. The system assumes that reduced emotional range directly translates into predictability. Operational constraints shape how this environment sustains itself. Continuous pharmaceutical supply is required to maintain effective suppression. Surveillance infrastructure must remain functional to detect deviations early. The system also depends on participants internalizing routine, since overt coercion is minimized. Any disruption to medication flow or monitoring capacity threatens the system's equilibrium. The systemic consequences follow logically. Social conflict is minimal because emotional triggers are chemically neutralized. Creativity resistance and long-term planning diminish as side effects rather than explicit goals. Authority becomes abstract, expressed through automated processes rather than human decision-makers. Individuals remain operational but interchangeable, optimized for stability rather than development. From a stability perspective, the system is internally consistent but fragile. It can persist indefinitely under controlled conditions, yet it lacks redundancy. Emotional suppression is a single point of failure. Once effect returns, suppressed impulses accumulate rapidly. Creating destabilization, the system is poorly equipped to absorb. Across these science fiction worlds, different surface narratives conceal a limited set of recurring system designs. Each world addresses the same operational problem: how to maintain stability under human unpredictability, by selecting a dominant control variable and building the environment around it. The technologies differ, but the structural logic repeats. One recurring pattern is variability suppression. Systems such as emotional regulation, genetic preselection, behavioral conditioning, and memory control all function by narrowing the range of acceptable internal states. Instead of responding to deviation after it occurs, these environments reduce the likelihood of deviation forming at all. Stability is achieved by minimizing behavioral spread rather than managing conflict. A second pattern is anticipatory governance. Predictive systems and lifecycle limits remove uncertainty by acting before accumulation becomes problematic. Time probability and projection are treated as controllable inputs. These systems replace reactive authority with preemptive structure-shifting control upstream from action to expectation. The environment stabilizes by deciding outcomes earlier in the process. Another repeated structure is contextual enclosure. Fully curated environments and mediated perception systems limit reference points by controlling exposure rather than movement. Participants retain freedom of action within the environment, but alternatives remain structurally inaccessible. Stability emerges because the system defines what can be experienced, not because it restricts motion directly. Several worlds rely on procedural inertia as a stabilizing force. Bureaucratic systems and containment architectures prioritize process continuity over situational judgment. Authority is distributed across mechanisms rather than individuals, reducing accountability while increasing persistence. These systems remain operational even when errors accumulate as long as procedures continue executing. Across all models, information management functions as a critical constraint. Whether through concealment, saturation, or fragmentation, information flow is regulated to prevent systemic awareness from forming. Stability depends less on secrecy than on shaping what information is usable within the system. Knowledge that cannot be integrated becomes operationally irrelevant. From a structural standpoint, none of these systems require overt coercion to persist. Control is embedded in design assumptions. What variables matter, which outcomes are optimized, and which forms of deviation are classified as noise. Collapse occurs not when force is resisted, but when core assumptions fail, when suppressed variables re-emerge, predictions misalign, or containment boundaries break. Viewed collectively, these worlds function as variations on the same design problem. Each system trades adaptability for predictability, reducing complexity to maintain order. The differences lie in which variable is selected for control, not in the logic of control itself. The technology changes. The systems don't. This analysis approached science fiction worlds as operational systems rather than narratives or warnings. Each film was examined through its internal rules, constraints, and logical consequences, treating world building as a form of system design. By focusing on structure instead of emotion or message, the mechanics that allow these environments to function become clearer. Seen this way, the films do not argue for or against particular outcomes. They demonstrate how stability can be engineered, how control can be embedded into design, and how different variables can be selected to manage complexity. Understanding these systems does not require agreement with them, only recognition of how their internal logic holds together once its assumptions are accepted. Taken together, these models offer a technical perspective on how imagined worlds maintain order, not through spectacle or ideology, but through structured decisions about rules, limits, and consequences.